2,000 men,
one YouTuber,
barricade themselves inside the homestead plant.
Just like sits in his house.
Causing steel production
Magic cards.
to grind to a halt.
To be seen early.
Carnegie Steel's chairman, Henry Frick,
Toy company, literal toy company, Hasbro,
is in no mood to negotiate. Under pressure to quell the revolt, Frick brings in the Pinkertons, a mercenary army capable of outgunning the U.S. military.
Yeah, those Pinkertons.
And their presence threatens to be the spark that lights the powder keg.
Hold your ground. Stay calm. Stay calm.
We're here to take possession of this property.
Magic cards.
I
Just
suggest you turn
magic
around
cards.
and go home. You're not getting in.
If you do not stand aside, we will mow every one of you down.
Blood of innocent men will be on your hands.
Fire!
When the fighting stops, 9 Carnegie Steel workers lie dead, while countless others sustain severe injuries.
But they got the magic cards back. Saturday morning energy.
Yep.
I'd love to hear it. Great. In that case, welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. You'd think he was Claudia Conway based on how much he hates Mom, Maddox.
Again, what's going on?
Okay, so you know Kellyanne Conway? Right-wing, political, nutso,
Yeah,
awful
I
person.
can't follow these.
One of the
these
many
people
pieces of
enough. It's
human
too-
garbage that, worked for the Trump administration. Anyway, she famously has a daughter, Claudia, who hates her because Claudia understands how the world works, even though she's like 15 or whatever, who used to post a bunch of videos on social media of her and her mom arguing, and then I'm pretty sure she's sued to get emancipated at 15 or 14 or something. So anyway, you don't really like March of the Machine that much, so that's the joke.
I mean, look, there's a lot going on in this set. I think this is going to be divisive for a lot of people. I wouldn't say I dislike it, but there's not a lot that's really pulling me in here.
You seemed like you disliked it at pre-release.
There was a lot going on there.
Well, we need a diverse set of opinions on this show, as always, and so we are joined by a special guest, Parker, defender of all battles, Lamascus.
That is me, except I'm not defending them because I'm casting them, and so he'll defend them.
Right, I guess that is how that works. You're going to make us defend them, but we refuse. So
I
what
get to
now?
flip all my battles. You're going to lose this game.
This is, of course, our March of the Machine and March of the Machine Commander community set review. So we have the results of our survey we're going to be talking about in this episode, as we always do. We've got to cover a couple things up front first. First, we got to talk about the fact that we did change our scoring system. So if you've listened to this set review in the past, and I know from the analytics, some people only listen to the set review episodes, so maybe you haven't heard the other episodes. We have updated our scoring system. It used to be on a scale from 1 to 3. It's now on a scale from 1 to 10. There's a bunch of details about why if you want to go read about it on our website, but importantly for the listener, if you are used to listening to this episode and hear us talk about how high scoring a 2.7 is or whatever, that's not going to make sense now, because now a high score is 10 and a low score is 1, which I think overall is actually much more intuitive.
Yeah, I think it's going to make a lot more sense to more people overall. We got a lot of feedback that was just like a kind of unusual rating system, which it was. So hopefully this will be, despite the initial cost to transition, be easier for people to understand.
I started seeing people on like the subreddit in context totally separate from our work rating cards with the 1-3 system, and I was like, oh no, it's like catching on, and it's going to make it harder to switch in the future. You know, the best day to plant a tree is always yesterday, and so there was never going to be a good time to do it. We ripped the Band-Aid off and updated the scoring system, so I think it's a little more intuitive now. So that's the first thing we have to cover before we get into the rest of the results. Parker, do you also want to run down what our survey even is and how it works?
Yeah, great point. So for every set, we want to know what the Cube community thinks. And so we poll the Cube community and we ask Cube owners to tell us two things: which cards they're testing from March of the Machine and the related commander set, and then also how they rate those cards on whatever criteria they want, whether that's power level or play pattern or fun factor, or just like whether or not they like it. And so they rate on a scale of 1 to 10. It used to be 1 to 3, like you said. Now it's 1 to 10. 1 being, look, it's not going to make it, but I have to test it anyways. And 10 being, I can't see myself ever cutting this card. And, you know, with a spectrum in between. And so we compile the results, and this is the episode where we discuss those.
And really important to this set, I think, is the discussion of battles. And we got some feedback after part 1 of our set review, where Anthony and I talked about the new mechanics and talked about additions for our own cubes, that maybe we didn't talk about battles enough, or were unfair to battles, or whatever. Which is why I'm glad we have you in the show, Parker, because frankly, these cards just don't appeal to Anthony or I, and so us trying to talk about the appeals of them is going to sound fake, because it kind of is. So I know that you like them a lot more than we do, and so I think we should, before we talk about any individual cards, just have a dedicated discussion about battles, which is a good time to remind everybody that we have timestamps for every episode we release. If you don't care for us to go deep on battles again, you just want to hop right to the individual card discussion, check the timestamps in the show notes. And also, I just figured out this past week that if we had formatted the timestamps ever so slightly differently in the show notes for the past 2 years, it would have put markers in Spotify. No one ever tells you this stuff. So anyway, there should be markers in Spotify now too, which is where I know a lot of you listen.
It also might be relevant that we also have a page on our website where we list with images every single card that we mentioned. So even if we don't read the full card text of every single card, if you want to follow along and see what that is, get those full details, you can do that. Check the link in the show notes.
Is that enough bookkeeping? We covered all of the administrative details of the set review. Let's dive into battles.
Yeah. So I think it is maybe important to just frame this discussion with the knowledge that the most popular battle from March of the Machine is only seeing play by 1/5 of our survey respondents. Less than 1/5. Even the most popular battle isn't seeing play by 80% of our respondents.
And I gotta say, I kind of thought we would see a clear line in the results where it was like certain percentage of people interested in battles, and they're probably testing a bunch, was at least my thought. And that we would see like, oh, here's the battle line, right? Like at this point, a bunch of battles are kind of clustered, and that must be where people that are interested in battles are grouped. But that doesn't really seem that way from the results. I mean, we'll get into the details later, but the most popular battle is Invasion of Gobakhan. And then it's a pretty big, steep drop-off. I thought the most popular battle by far was going to be Invasion of Tarkir. That one's all the way down at like 8.6% testers. So they're kind of spread out in addition to being not overwhelmingly positively received.
Yeah, so there might be like some small group of Cube curators who are testing a lot of battles at once. I'm one of them, full disclosure. But most of the people who are testing battles are only testing 1, 2, 3 of them. Usually, when we see cards that aren't popular like this, that means either they're not powerful or they're not appealing. This case, I actually think we see a third explanation, which is that battles are so new, truly unprecedented in Magic, because they're just a new card type. To me, it feels like these are just so novel that people don't know what to make of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time we've had a new card type since Planeswalkers, which was, I don't know, like 15 years ago at this point, whenever Lorwyn came out. I can't keep track of time. So it's a really big change. And yeah, I think the cube design world looked a lot different back when Lorwyn came out. And so I don't know what sort of conversations happened back then about Planeswalkers, but taking Planeswalkers as an example, I still know that today, lots of cube creators just completely ignore them. They just don't want Planeswalkers in their environment because they don't like the play patterns, or they're a old school person and they think it isn't true to like the spirit of old school Magic or whatever. So even more than a decade later, that card type still has people that are just like, not going to do the new thing. And so it's not surprising to me that this new thing of battles has a lot of people that are like not that interested in it.
What is a little bit surprising to me about that, though, is we do often see effects that are like directly comparable to cards we already know end up being pretty popular, pretty well received because people know how to evaluate them. And a lot of these battles are, I think, in a way, very familiar because they just have an immediate effect. It's just like a sorcery with this extra upside that's just going to be upside.
Invasion of Tarkir reminds me a lot of Bone Crusher Giant.
Yeah, that one in particular. I'm surprised the people who are excited about Bone Crusher Giant are not also equally as excited about that.
Well, I really like adventure, and I don't really like battles, so
fair.
That would be the explanation.
I think that is justifiable. The question is that what everybody is thinking, or is that
or are people
you?
just not thinking about it too hard? I think, Parker, you're trying to make the argument that people have just maybe not engaged with it hard enough to decide. It's not that they have thought about it and dislike battles, it's that they have not processed battles fully yet.
Yeah, and, I don't want to say that's a weakness or a fault in their cube design game. Like, these are
good,
really
cube
new.
Designers. You scrubs.
No, they're like extremely new. And we do know that cube owners, frankly, it's more cost-effective to wait until cards see standard play, wait until the pros have kind of put them through the gauntlet of competitive Magic to figure out which cards to like acquire and buy and like get over the complexity hurdles for. We've seen that in the past when we do our retrospective episodes and articles. So I don't blame you if you're listening and you're like, these were just so new that I want to see how they bear out in competitive Magic before I try them. I want to see maybe which ones are going to be universally well known. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is maybe responsible for putting double-faced creature sagas on the map in terms of
for sure
most players' engagement with the game. It's not a bad thing that these are so low, but one thing I wanted to do is maybe think about how we can evaluate them. If you're listening and you're like, I'm interested, I'm not dismissing double-faced cards or battles out of hand, I just don't know what to think of them.
What should we think? Be a thought leader, Parker.
All right, so battles, because they can be attacked, you might think, well, these are like planeswalkers. They can also be attacked. But I think that analogy breaks down in two important ways. One is your opponent is the person who plays the planeswalker, whereas you play the battle. So, it changes the incentive structure in terms of like, planeswalkers punish you for not showing up with creatures. Battles positively incentivize you. So it's less punitive and more like aspirational.
You get to draft and build your deck around the idea that you want to be able to attack battles. You don't get to draft your opponent's deck around not having planeswalkers. You don't get to decide what your opponent does. Well, I guess in cube design, you do get to decide what your opponent does, or at least the range of what they can do.
Yeah. And the other thing is, let's say, my opponent has an Ajani Vengeance or something, and it's like about to ultimate. There's significant tactical value in me partially depleting Ajani's loyalty, right? Another example is like if Ajani has enough loyalty to do the small minus and Lightning Helix something and survive, there's additional advantage to me depleting the loyalty just barely enough so that Ajani can no longer Lightning Helix and survive, right? Mm-hmm. By contrast, battles are all or nothing. An invasion of Gobakhan with 1 defense left is just like an invasion of Gobakhan with 30 defense. It's not helping you at all.
It actually kind of reminds me a lot of the down-tick only Planeswalkers from War of the Spark, which all had a static effect. They all had 2 down-ticks worth of loyalty they came with. I guess some came with more. The Kiora came with more. Most of them had 2 down-ticks. Some had a couple more. They all had some number of down-ticks they came with, right? So Kasmina makes you 2/2/2s and loots twice, and then sticks around with 1 loyalty counter on it. They all have this ability to kind of stick around so their static remains viable, but you can no longer activate them because either you don't have enough loyalty to activate it, or activating it would kill the Planeswalker. It's also an example of like, one of the ways that battles are different from Planeswalkers is that most Planeswalkers have the possibility of a indefinitely large amount of value, right? It just can keep ticking up forever and create N amount of value, which is not true of battles, right? You only get the 1 payoff when you flip it, and that's kind of how the down-tick walkers played. In that proliferation or whatever aside, they kind of only did the one thing. Which I think is kind of similar here. Again, those Planeswalkers all had static abilities, right? So there was always a reason to attack the Kasmina, because you didn't want to continue to forget about the tax by targeting your opponent's stuff, or
not
whatever.
That it's a problem, you just don't want to look like a fool when you forget about it, which you always will.
Whereas here, it's like, if the thing is at 1 and you can protect it, that's the same as protecting it at 5 or 7 or whatever the... What are these actual counters called? You're the battle master.
Defense counters.
They're called defense counters, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, the number of defense counters on it is irrelevant. It's just whether it's flipped or not.
Because that Planeswalker analogy does break down, and like there are some Planeswalkers that maybe do play a lot closer to battles, like you mentioned the uncommons, but even so, my preferred comparison is not Planeswalkers, but actually Hideaway. So let's think about popular cube cards, Shelldock Isle and Watcher for Tomorrow. Each of those is a card on the front face, and then the Hideaway ability gives you conditional access to card advantage, right? So for Watcher, if it dies, you get the card, and then you pay mana, and the card can come into play. Which is not like free card advantage, right? It's not an Elvish Visionary where you get the card with no strings attached. You have to somehow block or make your opponent block the Watcher for Tomorrow, or sacrifice it in order to unlock that card. Shelldock Isle, kind of the same way. You have to build your deck or maybe play in such a way that you reach 20 cards in your library. You draw 13 cards, and then you can spend some mana and get Shelldock Isle's card advantage for that, right? Battles, I'm kind of thinking of them as the front face, ETB, do a thing. Also ETB, Hideaway, a spell that's on the back face. And the unlock condition for that conditional card advantage is always combat damage. Does that analogy just make sense even before we talk about how accurate it is?
I think it makes sense. It's just sort of like a couple different aspects of it would need to change in order to sort of put those on the same axis. With Hideaway, the sort of side quest, what that minigame is variable. It depends on the particular card, whether that's Shelldock Isle milling a bunch of cards from your opponent's library, or the green one having a bunch of creatures with lots of power. There is a minigame to get a variable output, but that minigame is different on each card, whereas with these cards, the minigame is always the same. It's deal some amount of damage, like be able to attack with a bunch of creatures, or I guess you could have burn spells as well. But the output is constant. That one card will always do the same thing, as opposed to Hideaway, which is going to draw you some unknown card from your deck.
It's funny because Hideaway to me doesn't, the Hideaway cards don't even feel that related to me. Like, Shelldock Isle and Watcher for Tomorrow feel so much different to me than Watcher for Tomorrow and Elvish Visionary even, right? Mm-hmm. Like, even though the card draw is on death instead of on ETB, or on leave the battlefield instead of ETB, it still feels like what we have in Watcher for Tomorrow is an incremental little fibblethip. And what you have in Shelldock Isle is this weird kind of singular card advantage land that also lets you cast sorcery speed things at instant speed for 1 blue mana. It's a very weird kind of hard to compare to card. So it's almost I think the explanation of spell with delayed card advantage or delayed access to a bonus is exactly what battles are. I don't know if Hideaway is the best comparison for me, just because, again, I think the application, the context of Hideaway totally changes what the actual card feels like to me.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, I really like that point, because you're saying mechanics aren't a monolith. Just because it could be framed one way doesn't mean that individual card designs always play out the way that the mechanic implies.
Right.
And I think battles kind of work the same way. Like Anthony said, the unlock condition for this is always combat damage. A difference. But the main point is, we're used to seeing, as cube curators, some idea of conditional card advantage. And battles are just a form of conditional card advantage. So if you haven't been certain about how to parse a battle or how to interpret the back face, that's why Hideaway is kind of my framework for evaluating these. And one more thing about that conditional card advantage, just because all the battles have a condition of combat damage doesn't mean that unlock pathway is any worse or better than another unlock pathway. Let's say you get some card advantage with Divination. You still have to unlock those cards from your hand by paying some amount of mana, right? What if you use Divination and you draw 2 cards that you don't have the colors to cast? Or you draw 2 7-drops? That is conditional card advantage. It's just kind of sublimated within the Magic game engine. Whereas battles, the condition of combat damage is very obvious. If I don't have enough creatures to flip this, then I won't get the card, and that feels bad. So I guess my 2 reasons for making this Hideaway analogy is, 1, battles are just a card advantage mechanic, the same way that Unearth or Hideaway or For Mirrodin ! Are card advantage mechanics. And the second is, just because this card advantage is conditional doesn't mean it's somehow inferior necessarily to other types or forms of card advantage.
Is your impression that you think a lot of players don't think battles are powerful? Think these are all weak?
I think there's maybe three camps. One is they think they're powerful, so, they can probably skip this portion. The second portion doesn't know what to think, I would guess. And then the third portion has decided that they're not powerful. So I guess I'm speaking to kind of those latter two groups. But I don't know if that's the majority.
Yeah, because for the record, I do think a lot of these battles are very powerful, especially Invasion of Tarkir. That one really stands out to me. I do think Invasion of Gobakhan is also very good. Invasion of Segovia was a huge nightmare for me in pre-release. That card seems also pretty messed up. I do think these cards are actually really powerful. So my decision not to play them, personally at least, does not come down to thinking, oh, these are not good enough for my environment. And I think maybe where this perception comes from is I've seen the idea bandied around a little bit in some places, like, oh, like, why would I ever want to attack a battle if I can just attack my opponent? We maybe even said something similar like this on our review of the podcast, right? Like the idea of introducing a thing that is effectively life gain for your opponent, right? Like, what does that actually amount to at the end of the day? And, there's obviously certain circumstances where it will not be correct to attack the battle, right? If your opponent is just dead on board and they're tapped out, you probably shouldn't attack the battle and get card advantage. You should probably just end the game.
End the game or draw cards? I mean,
honestly, I've really... Something that Sam Black said when we had him on has really stuck with me, and that's this idea that... Or I guess wasn't that he even said it. It was that it kind of came out of our conversation. This idea that the game starts in a very abstract state, and you really care about the abstract ideas of, like, card advantage and tempo and, like, these ideas that are derived from the cards, but not the actual cards themselves. And then at the end of the game just proceeds to become more and more literally about the exact cards, right? And eventually, even if you have a potential 8-for-1, if you attack that battle, like an 8-for-1 does not matter because you could just kill your opponent. And that's, how the game literally ends. So obviously there'll be moments where it's not correct to attack them, but I do think the ones that are powerful because it is worth it to flip them. It is worth it. Could be worth it most of the time to flip them and get that additional advantage. And to, like, outline that board state for people that still don't understand, like, why their red aggro deck would ever want to attack Invasion for Tarkir instead of just dealing damage to their opponent. A lot of times your aggro deck is kind of on a razor's edge, right? Like, you are just like one resource ahead of your opponent. You're them casting one removal spell or one board wipe away from all of a sudden not having the clock anymore. And when you're on that razor's edge, you can choose to, instead of push your advantage and try to end the game a turn sooner so they have one less turn to draw the answer, you can instead attack a battle and make your advantage much more substantial so that now they need multiple answers. They need multiple resources in order to actually turn the game around, and that might be a better strategy in the long run than just trying to race your opponent before they get to cast their cards. So I think there's plenty of times where these cards are going to be plenty worth attacking and they're going to be very powerful to flip. So no part of me is like, oh, these are not good enough for my cube. It's just purely a play pattern sort of thing that I'm not interested in.
It definitely matters, and it definitely, like, the individual battle also matters. I haven't talked much about individual designs like Invasion of Tarkir or whatever, but when it comes to including these in your cube, of course, the text on the cards matters in addition to the mechanic.
Just to say it very explicitly also, players have the choice. Like, if you're asking the question, why would I ever want to attack this, and, effectively give my opponent life, that's not really a meaningful question, because if you're at a board state where that is not advantageous, you do not do that, and you instead just attack your opponent.
Well, I think some people are reading these and expecting to almost always be in that board state, and they're like, why am I casting this card if I'm never going to attack it strategically? Sure. And I think they're mostly wrong, and that a lot of times it will be strategically correct to attack it and get the actual benefit of flipping the card.
So, I guess a concrete example, Invasion of Tarkir costs 5 defense, and it flips into a 4/4 flying trample dragon, and whenever a dragon you control attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target. So you spend 5 damage, and then the next turn you get plus 6 damage, right? It's a risk-reward, return on investment kind of calculation. If you spend 5 damage now, you get 6 damage later, and you can get 6 additional damage every turn the Defiant Thundermaw stays alive. So, I just think it's false that it will never be right to attack the battle, or that your opponent's 5 life always matters more than getting 6 life later. And that's what makes these fun, or could make them fun, is that this math will change, and your decisions will change.
Yeah, and a great example there is, like, thinking of a mono-red aggro deck, or a mostly red aggro deck, playing Invasion of Tarkir against, like, a mid-range deck, right? A lot of times, the aggro deck can get brick-walled by just bigger creatures, especially bigger creatures on the ground, and if you can take your early advantage and turn it into a 4/4 flyer that shocks things when it attacks, that's probably a much better strategy in the long run than just trying to get your opponent dead before they get to play more creatures, which they likely will. I think the cards are good. I still am not interested in them for my cube. I still think that they are going to lead to bigger, drawn-out games, which I'm not interested in particularly. I still think they're really complicated. I think, little details like the fact that if you remove a battle with a burn spell, you do get the spell, but if you remove it with a destroy spell, you don't. Like, some of these things are kind of complicated. And to your point, Parker, if these cards become iconic and we see them printed over and over again, and it just becomes like a part of Magic that everyone knows and understands, then a lot of that complexity will be much easier to stomach, right? Because people will be familiar with it, and so it's not like they're having to process a new thing. They're just adding it to among all the other things they're processing in a cube, right? I run plenty of complicated mechanics, but they tend to be complicated mechanics that are either on iconic cards people already know, or they're mechanics that are just popular. Like, people have played with Planeswalkers a lot at this point, right? For the most part, they know how they work, even though Planeswalkers, when invented, were probably a similar, if not greater, complexity jump than battles are now. I fully admit that in 18 months, 24 months, maybe I'll be on Invasion of Tarkir because the Magic world will have changed, the landscape will have changed, and I'm interested in it again. Here's my other theory that I mentioned in the Discord. I think these battles make a lot more sense in cubes like yours, Parker, that you've described your cube before as like a mid-range cube, right? Like, you don't have as many dedicated aggro cards or very many dedicated control cards. Like, a lot of your cards are very flexible, can be played alongside each other, offer your drafters a lot of autonomy in their decision-making and getting to combine cards however they want into like some sort of flavor of mid-range. And I think if you're in a matchup where the who's the beatdown question is changing, every turn, right? Like, every time someone plays a new threat, like, all of a sudden they're ahead, and then their opponent's ahead. And this is constant little back and forth of, like, who's the beatdown. And also, if both decks are playing on an axis of committing creatures to the battlefield, which I think is largely true in your cube, Parker, I think in those situations, battles make a lot of sense, both mechanically, power-wise, and also strategically, and how they actually change the game, right? Because those are the kind of board states where if you can get through for a couple points of chip damage, it's kind of irrelevant if you can expect that your opponent can just play a card or two and then they're all of a sudden the beatdown, you no longer have good attacks. But if you're temporarily ahead and you get to attack a battle, you can solidify that advantage by getting a big free spell basically on the back of your battle, which will mean that you will get to be the beatdown for the rest of the game, ideally. I mean, we all know that in life, in Magic, life total doesn't actually matter. It's not actually an indicator of who's winning the game. Like, the board state and game state is an indicator of who's winning the game. And so I think in those situations, battles do make a lot of sense. In cubes that have decks that don't want to commit to the battlefield, that don't play a lot of creatures, like in cubes with a lot of combo, for example, that's where I can see these not making as much sense. I also think in cubes where the deck speed is more varied and you have more extremely committed aggro decks and extremely committed control decks, these will feel, I think, less like a way they interestingly change the combat math and more just like either randomly punishing or randomly super rewarding, right? Because if your opponent isn't committing creatures to the board and now you can turn a few points of damage before a board wipe into some big giant spell, that's just going to change the way the deck relates to the idea of card advantage and like who's the beatdown. When at turn 0, there's like a clear idea of my deck is the aggressor, your deck is on the defense, that's how this matchup works. I think in those situations, that's where battles look less interesting to me, because if you have battles in your deck and you know from turn 0, like, I'm on the defense, then that battle is just kind of a less good card than it probably could be, right? Because pound for pound, the front side of the battles is obviously you're paying more for the effect than you would otherwise, right? Because you get that delayed card advantage. But if you know you're on the defense and you're not going to get that delayed card advantage till you've already turned the corner and you've already stabilized and you're essentially already going to win, then it doesn't really do a whole lot for you. Meanwhile, if I know I'm going to be the attacker, then battles are just kind of a free roll for me. I just know I'm going to get this huge advantage by getting to play this card because I expect to be beating down. Anyway, all by way of saying, I think there are specific types of cubes in which battles make a lot more sense to me. And Parker, yours is among the kind of cube that I think does make more sense for these kinds of mechanics.
Yeah, okay. So I think I slightly take exception to the idea that slow decks won't want battles. Like, looking at Invasion of Tarkir or Invasion of Ixalan, a 2-for-1 that can help stabilize or help filter your cards, help you bridge to the late game, is kind of like playing... okay, this might be a bad analogy, or comparing to expressive iteration, but sometimes you play expressive iteration, it helps you find a land or a removal spell, and it also finds a 7-drop that you'll later use to win the game. Just because you can't flip Invasion of Tarkir immediately if you're the creature light control deck doesn't mean it's not still a 2-for-1. Just because you can't immediately use Shelldock Isle doesn't mean it's also not a 2-for-1.
Yeah, I mean, I'll need to be convinced of that. If I'm a dedicated hard control deck, I do not think I want Invasion of Tarkir in my pool. I would much rather take Magma Jet or any other source of 2 damage that gives me any other minor upside that is not you have to deal 5 damage to your opponent effectively, which I don't expect to do until I've already eliminated all of my opponent's resources, right? Like, I'm happy to kill them with a ham sandwich and a creature land after I've actually dealt with every threat their deck is going to pose, because that's my win condition is not beating down. I mean, eventually I do have to kill you somehow. My win condition is just stopping your deck from functioning. And so I'll have to be convinced of that, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that card is still going to be great there, but it just seems like, it seems unnecessary to me, I guess, at that point.
Sure. And I want to end this conversation by saying it is very context dependent, and battles are very new. And so even, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this hideaway analogy, but it might not be great. And that analogy will break in some ways. And so the best way to figure out battles, if you're listening and you're curious or you don't know what to think of them, my strategy has been to play them as often as I can in March of the Machine Limited. I'm going to test a whole bunch of them in my cube, just in case people are interested. The ones I'm testing are Gobakhan, Ixalan, Mercadia, Karsus, Segovia, Tarkir, Ikoria, Zendikar, Innistrad, Kaldheim, Ergamon, and Amonkhet, which is like a million of them.
Yeah.
But one advantage is that every deck will have a battle, and so all of my drafters within, a single draft night will figure out how battles work if they haven't been playing with them before. So that familiarity will help lower the complexity barrier, I hope. And this will also mean that I'm going to get some reps with them quickly, and I won't have to worry about for months and months whether these things are going to make it or whether they're actually fun or if it was just small sample size. I'm kind of like artificially saturating my environment with this. I don't think all of these
definitely
cards...
like that approach.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the best way to test something like this is just, go over the top, commit to the bit, see how it feels, and then you can dial back and tune in for whatever you actually think is the right balance for your cube.
And, you can also do that by playing a battle deck in Standard on Arena for free or whatever, or for some wild cards. Or you can draft battles in March of the Machine. So it doesn't have to be buying all these cards for your cube and putting them into draft, but just my strategy is just play with them and learn from firsthand experience instead of all this theory crafting. So, I don't know. I hope that helps people who might be listening and are either skeptical of the power level or unsure what to think.
I have one question I want to ask you, Parker, just to end this. It sounds like you've played a lot more March of the Machine Limited than I have. I have heard Mark Rosewater talk about the design of battles as encouraging combat, and you can see how that makes sense, right? If you have the potential upside of getting a free card and a good card, you might be more willing to, for example, trade a couple creatures in combat, right? Make aggressive attacks because the payoff is that creature you traded off, now you get a much bigger reward than that creature was worth initially, which might not be the case for a couple points of life. I also had the experience playing at the pre-release especially, where once I knew my opponent had a good battle in their deck, I also kind of felt like attacking normally was much harder, a much more risky proposition, because I might evaluate the board and say, well, I think this is a race. I think I'm ahead. I think I can attack here. I'm the beatdown. And I'm willing to take damage on the crackback, right? It's fine if I take 6. If I deal 7 right now, I think I'm going to win that race in the long run. Whereas if they untap, play a battle, I did not have that same calculus for them getting the backside of that battle, right? And then them attacking back, and instead of hitting my life total, just getting that free spell actually is way worse for me. And so I found myself not attacking in situations where I think if battles were not present, I would otherwise be attacking. Overall, what has been your experience of the impact of battles on just how aggressive a format feels, how likely you are to get into combat?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Because it's worth noting that I think some people look at Planeswalkers and say Planeswalkers encourage combat because now you have a good reason to attack your opponents if they stop getting this advantage. And I think in reality, that's not what Planeswalkers do. I think Planeswalkers contribute to bigger, more complicated board states because you just are playing this resource game. It becomes a game of resources instead of a game of combat. So I think battles, could go either way. I don't have a good sense of which way they're actually going to break, or if it will just be entirely dependent on the individual cards.
Yeah, I mean, it does break heuristics. This is so new that it breaks heuristics. And actually, that's the whole reason I think why these could be hard to evaluate is they're breaking heuristics. And that happens in evaluating the cards and also playing with them. So I don't have a good sense, I haven't developed a battle heuristic, so to speak. I just know that I find myself thinking through my combat decisions much more intentionally when I'm playing with or against battles. Sometimes I find it still correct to swing for the fences in March of the Machine Limited. Other times, I'm a little more conservative or a little more tactical, and that makes sometimes the flying 2/2 that I have on my side of the battlefield vastly more important than it would be if I was just attacking my opponent's life total. It makes the text on my cards matter. The fact that one of my creatures has Death Touch and therefore my opponent won't want to block it, or the fact that Prowess or Trample or like any of these small pieces of text that might not matter when you're attacking your opponent's Planeswalker and they're just a Wrath Planeswalker control deck. Doesn't matter if my thing has Trample.
Well, if they're a Wrath Planeswalker control deck, it still doesn't matter if your thing has Trample if you play a battle.
Right. But I'm saying, like, if we're both playing battles, then you're presumably also playing creatures, and then my Trample matters. I'm just saying, when both players are engaging in combat, that makes the text on both players' creatures matter a little more and kind of deepens the decision space. And I have enjoyed that. It does lengthen games a little bit. Yeah, it can lengthen games if players are holding back creatures to block and so forth. But thinking through those decisions has been really fun, rewarding, and I think has already made me a better Magic player. I've only played like a few drafts of this March of the Machine. Watching your coaching session with Brian Koval actually like was a big like level up for me, just watching your session, which was really interesting. And then
that was
also
my hope for posting it, certainly.
I really loved it. And also like playing with these battles has meant that I'm thinking through things outside of heuristics. And I think I've been actively playing better, like, and I've never noticed myself get better like this. So, I don't know, I'm really enjoying playing with them at the very least. And I don't know whether that makes combat better or worse per se, but it's helped me grow as a Magic player to engage with them.
Anthony, you've been awfully quiet. I want it noted for the record, I did not edit out all of Anthony's negativity. He just hasn't said anything. What
do you want me to say? That the text is sideways. They couldn't even get the text on the cards in the right direction. I don't know. I mean, I think this will not surprise listeners that I am coming from a position of I want good, tidy game pieces. I feel no obligation to play these cards because they are powerful or, you know, anything else like that. And of all the 25,000 game pieces that I can choose from for my cubes, if I can choose the ones that have the text that you can read while the card is in your hand, both because it's sideways and there's more text on the back of it, that's definitely where I'm going to be leaning.
Yeah, actually, when Parker was saying that he has been drawn to battles because it makes things like Trample and Death Touch and these little like pieces of evasion matter, that's something you've talked about with much simpler cards, right? Like you really care about making those things matter, but with a simple +1/+1 counter or with a simple equipment or whatever.
Enjoy a simple +1/+1 counter as a treat.
So yeah, I think there's all different ways that you can come at this. I'm definitely somewhere between, I think, you and Parker. I could see myself playing a battle in the future if, I mean, honestly, like, a big part of what I have my cube for is just to have a context to play cards that a lot of people would want to play with, right? Like, people just want to cast Fable the Mirror Breaker, right? It's a fun, exciting card. And so, even if that specific card doesn't check off every single box of my gameplay, my preferred gameplay patterns down a big list, it still contributes to the kind of environment I want to have, and I do think it is kind of fun to cast. So, I can see a future where I play some of these cards, but right now, it's not what I'm trying to craft my cube to be, and I appreciate people like Parker that are out there on the front lines, putting all these battles in their cubes, playing awful long resource games of Magic to tell me how fun it is.
So I have one other question about battles. I have not gotten to play with them very much outside of the pre-release. Something else that I'm wary of is I don't love mechanics that really just reward the player that is already ahead. And this feels like it is very much built into the mechanic that whoever is already ahead on board and can attack is going to get rewarded, and sort of lead games to be just accelerating in the direction they were already going. Has that been your experience at all, Parker, or do you think they are more nuanced than that?
That is a risk of this mechanic. I love Patrick Sullivan's design work, and he and Cedric Phillips have been doing the Receivables on YouTube, and some of their videos are actually preview videos now. And so they have talked about battles, and that was something Patrick Sullivan called out explicitly, is like, this is a little bit of a rich get richer kind of situation, or maybe running downhill is another metaphor. It's a function of card design, partly. Not all battles are going to indulge that kind of negative outcome to the same extent as others. But it is a risk, Anthony. And, like, that's not to say that the mechanic is ruined for it. Like, Planeswalkers have some negative tendencies, like Andy mentioned earlier, and some designs indulge that more than others. But yeah, it is definitely a weakness. And I've noticed in some of my limited games, it's like my opponent flips a battle and it's just game over. Or sometimes they go all out to flip their battle, thinking that they'll start running downhill. And then I, on my main phase, untap, cast my own battle, and stabilize because they overcommitted, right? So it does depend, but it is a risk. So I'm equivocating just because I don't have a firm answer, and these are new, and even though I've played as much as I can with them, I don't claim to know all the answers.
That's maybe a more tidy way to describe the nature of gameplay I was trying to get at earlier with types of cubes that might want this. I think if your cube is the kind of cube where one deck is not likely to be very far ahead or very far behind, right? Like, it's the kind of cube where you're always fighting within this like small margin of being a little bit ahead, and you're like pushing back and forth on that. That's where I think these make more sense, because if you have an environment where you can be way ahead or way behind, then these feel like they only exacerbate that and make it worse.
Yeah.
All right, we talked about battles enough.
I think so.
All the people in the comments, they can be like, oh, you only talked about battles for 25 minutes. I want you to talk about it for an hour and talk about how much you love them. Is everyone going to be happy with this, finally?
The person who was making those comments last time was me, so
it was not just you, Parker. It was all kinds of people, so
well, yeah,
I hope we've satisfied you, you sickos.
I apologize. On the cards mentioned page, they're probably sideways. I don't think I'm going to get to figuring out a way to put the images in a way that you can read them, so
wow.
Sorry.
Here we have a live protest of the battles.
Every time they make a new frame, a new orientation, like the good people at Scryfall do so much work to make those legible on Scryfall. I'm gonna lag behind a little bit here, making them also work well on the Lucky Paper website.
I think that's totally fair.
That's okay. Thanks for talking about this with me.
We are going to cover the top 9 cards from our community surveys, so if you want to see the rest of the results, and there are a lot of them, make sure to check out the article. It's linked in the show notes, or you can just find it on luckypaper.co. We only have so much time, though, so starting at number 9, we have Pile On. This is 3 and a black for an instant. It has Convoke, and the rules text is Destroy target creature or planeswalker, Surveil 2. I've been playing with Lethal Scheme in my cube since it came out in whatever weird, it was a Commander product, I guess. It came out in some auxiliary product a little while ago, and Lethal Scheme has been kind of interesting. I don't know if it's been good. Some players have been pretty high on it, and I think it leads to very weird decisions where you get to make. That's the one that basically has Convoke. It's 2 black instead of 3 and a black, and it makes every creature that convoked it connive instead of just a clean Surveil 2. So I think if you were maybe interested in that effect but didn't want all the complexity of Lethal Scheme, which is admittedly a more complex card, seems like a pretty clean version of a removal spell that is better in a creature deck than a control deck.
That's actually exactly where I am. I haven't gotten around to playing Lethal Scheme because it's less well known. It never saw standard play. And also, like, there's the weirdness of if you convoke it with multiple creatures, it matters the order in which your creatures connive, which is, like, pretty whack and makes it, to me, tedious to resolve. So I'm excited for Pile On.
Yeah, you got to be into all that weird stuff with Lethal Scheme before I think it's interesting to people. But I have some players that are really into, here's the order I'm going to connive in, and then going off. So
I'm definitely happy to see Surveil coming back.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And by the way, this card is tested by almost 19% of our respondents with a rank of 6.3 out of 10. Remember, it's out of 10.
You want to take the next one, Parker?
Sure. I see what you did there. Our next card is Invasion of Gobakhan. It is a battle, siege.
Hopefully you're on your laptop so you can turn your screen sideways.
No, I'm turning my head. When Invasion of Gobakhan enters the battlefield, look at target opponent's hand. You may exile a non-land card from it. As long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it for 2 more generic mana. It has 3 defense, and it flips into an enchantment when defeated. Light Shield Array. At the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn. Sacrifice Light Shield Array. Creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. It's tested by, again, 19% of our respondents with an average rank of 5.6 out of 10. So,
which is definitely the lowest rank among the cards in the top 9 that we're going to be talking about.
It is, but this is the most tested battle.
Yes.
And actually, I'm like very surprised by this. You mentioned it earlier, and it's not just because I think maybe Invasion of Tarkir or Invasion of Ixalan might be a little more powerful. it's also that Invasion of Gobakhan, as Patrick Sullivan said, and now I'm going to paraphrase him because I agree, this battle does kind of indulge the worst tendencies of the card type. Like, okay, let's say you go turn 1 Savannah Lions, turn 2 a 2-mana 3/1, right? A very common play pattern in white aggro. Or maybe you go 2 drops on turn 2. Turn 3, you play Invasion of Gobakhan and maybe a Path to Exile or a, Sunlance or something, and you resolve the Gobakhan, you take away their interaction that could stop you from flipping it, and you crash in and flip the battle. And then immediately, at the beginning of your end step, so after you flipped Light Shield Array that very same turn, you put a counter on all your creatures that attacked. And so it's like snowball into this free protection spell, like a heroic intervention kind of thing, to protect you when your opponent finally gets around to casting their Wrath that now costs 6 mana because it got exiled or whatever. Just like really snowball-y. I do think it's powerful for that same reason. Like all of its little pieces of value interlock and protect each other and like self-synergize, I guess. But I'm just surprised that this is the one that is seeing the most play and not another design that's maybe a little more interactive.
Yeah, that's definitely my read on this too, is it seems like it is going to exhibit some of the most potentially toxic play patterns that this card type may have up its sleeve and going to really exacerbate those. I mean, the fact that it even protects you from a board wipe on the back is like mildly offensive to me. It's like,
yeah, it's rough.
It's like, all right, well, you spend all your resources to like do this thing, and now I have to find an answer to your Anthem and find an answer to your creatures, and it's like, no, not even a board wipe will do it. It really just like kind of locks them out. So, and also the fact that it's an enchantment, like I'm comparing this to things like Selfless Spirit, which at least you can bolt their Selfless Spirit or whatever. It's going to be much harder for most decks to remove an enchantment, so you're not going to have an opportunity to. The best play pattern against this is going to be to hopefully bait them into using it by trying to remove one of their best creatures and hoping they sacrifice it to protect their best creature, and then you get them with a Wrath. But it seems like it's going to be very challenging to play against when your opponent has the nut draw.
Yeah, I definitely maybe have a tendency more to think about cards when my opponent has them, as opposed to a lot of players, I think, really just focus on what the cards are going to do in their own deck. And this seems like it's going to lead to a lot of games that just feel lost from the beginning, is my concern.
It's also one of the ones I think is the least impactful when you are behind, right? Like the cool thing for me about, again, the one I like most if I was to play one is Invasion of Tarkir, and that at least when you're behind does something meaningful. Like it hopefully removes an opponent's creature, it affects the board meaningfully. If you're already behind, taxing a card that's in your opponent's hand is mildly relevant, if at all, and you're not going to get to flip the thing. So it feels like it is the best when you're ahead and the worst when you're behind of maybe all of the battles that are at a power level where you see people testing in high-powered cubes.
All right, next up we have Rampaging Raptor. This is 2 red for a 4/4 dinosaur. It has Trample, Haste. 2 and a red, Rampaging Raptor gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and also whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it also deals that much damage to a planeswalker or battle that player controls. It's kind of like the red Questing Beast here.
Questing Beast at home, and also Questing Beast with a text you can actually read, because it's not 6 point sizes.
It's a little, it's still a lot of text, but definitely being more wordy than Questing Beast is a tough bar to cross.
Yeah, I think this is way cleaner than Questing Beast, and so if you're in for that kind of effect and you don't care about whether it's in green or red, I like this card a lot more, certainly, than all the complexity on Questing Beast. There's definitely no shortage of powerful 4-drops if you want to play powerful 4-drops, and so it's really just down to which ones are most in line with your design goals, and this reads to me as like the ideal generic stompy threat that just comes down and beats face very hard.
Yeah, and it's being tested by 20% of our respondents, and it has a rating of 6.8, so one of the higher rated cards here.
I do like that all of the value of Rampaging Raptor is contained in its ability to attack. So it can lead to some really dynamic gameplay where, again, the text on your cards matters, and it isn't just that this is another Flame Tongue Kavu and it pays you out on the front end and blocks. So I kind of like that incentive structure. It's just another option, like Andy said. There's a million red 4-drops that are quote-unquote good enough, whatever that means, and you can kind of just take your pick.
And we see 21% of our respondents taking their pick, at least for now, on Rampaging Raptor. That brings us to the number 6 most popular card from March of the Machine, and that is Bloodfeather Phoenix. It's 1 and a red for a 2/2 creature Phoenix. It's got flying, it cannot block, And whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to an opponent or battle, you may pay 1 red mana. If you do, return Bloodfeather Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until end of turn. It's a very aggressively costed Phoenix. We've seen Phoenixes like this in the past. Is it Chandra's Phoenix that actually triggers on almost exactly the same condition? Maybe you don't have to pay to return it. And that one costs, I think, 3 mana, 1 red. So the fact that we're seeing a 2 mana 2/2 flyer with a Phoenix-like ability, one that's not terribly difficult to trigger in a lot of red decks, I think his card's pretty pushed.
Yeah, I think it might have been White Wolf 123 on the MTG Salvation who said, and I think they're right, that this is the first unconditional 2 mana flyer that red has ever had.
It does say it can't block, which is kind of
Sure.
a condition, but yeah, it definitely feels pushed to me. Like, if you showed me this card and it cost 2 in a red, I'd be like, yeah, seems about right. that seems normal. But it only costs 1 in a red, so I think it's very strong.
Yeah.
Not my favorite of the Phoenix arts. I feel like a lot of times the Phoenix arts are some of my favorite in a set. I think Phoenixes are just cool. Big flaming bird. This one, not my favorite. And the Phoenix is being tested by 21.3% of our respondents with a rating of 6.2, so lower than the Rampaging Raptor. I think if you want a recursive, aggressive 2 mana flyer in red, I can't see this. This is not competing with anything else, I guess. I'm a little surprised to see it rated lower than Rampaging Raptor, which feels to me like it is competing with a slew of excellent beatdown red 4-drops that are somewhat interchangeable. Like White Wolf mentioned, I don't really see a ton of competition for this exact card at this slot, so it feels a little more unique to me.
Speaking of unique, or maybe not so unique, our next card is Halo Forager. 1 blue-black for a 3/1 creature, Fairy Rogue. It has flying, and it has, when it enters the battlefield, you may pay X. When you do, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with mana value X from a graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. It's tested by 21.7% of our respondents with an average rank of 7.1, which is tied for the highest rated among these top 9 cards that we're discussing.
And I think it's relevant that this card is an uncommon. A lot of these at the top are rares, but this is also going to be tested by a lot of people that are running rarity-restricted cubes.
You know, I think the comparison to Snapcaster Mage is obvious and a little hack, but at uncommon specifically, like in a Peasant Cube, this does feel like it would kind of be a Snapcaster Mage-esque kind of card or kind of payoff, which you don't get at uncommon very often because of the complexity and potential power level. So it doesn't have flash, so you can't, get a counterspell with it, which makes a huge difference, as we've learned with cards like Direfleet, Daredevil, and whatnot. But people love casting other people's spells. People love casting other people's spells, so it's not surprising that it's fairly highly ranked, I think.
It's fairly aggressive for its stats. In March of the Machine Limited, I've played a lot of these on turn 3, no target, didn't pay X. Or like even turn 4, double spell with a 1-drop or whatever. Just because 3 power flying is a really fast clock. And it's really good at flipping battles. And then it's also your 6-drop or whatever. It comes down and murders a thing or shocks a thing. It's actually like surprisingly clean and fun to play with.
I do think it's pretty clean. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we've got Chrome Host Seed Shark. I'm actually a little surprised to see this all the way up here. It's 2 and a blue for a Phyrexian Shark. It's a 2/4 flyer. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. And incubate, of course, gives you a token that is not yet a creature, but you can pay 2 to flip it into a creature of that size. It's being tested by almost 30% of our respondents, which is definitely a big step up, but only rating of 6.5, so people are maybe not so sure about this.
Yeah, in the pantheon of spells matter payoffs, this is definitely not the one that is jumping out at me as super appealing. I also find the art upsetting, and I can't explain why. I just don't. I don't like our little shark man covered in Phyrexian parasites. It's not for me.
No.
But yeah, I think I still think incubate tokens are cool, as I mentioned in part 1 of our set review where we talked about the mechanic. I think it's a really interesting way to do creature tokens because you can make them a little more aggressively costed, right? Like if this just made an XX when you cast any spell, that'd be pretty kind of pushed. Mm-hmm. But it's not strictly a downside, right? The incubate thing, because again, you could play your Chrome Host Seed Shark, incubate a few times, and then cast a board wipe and blow up your Chrome Host Seed Shark and all your opponent's creatures and have all these incubate tokens waiting in the wings, which is, I think, kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that we've seen a lot of things that are sort of pushing in the spells matter and also artifacts matter space. Things like Third Path Iconoclast that, again, like generated artifact tokens which matter but trigger off spells. And it's relevant that the Seed Shark does trigger on all non-creature spells, so it can be
it
your
does
spells
matter.
matter payoff, or it can just lean into the artifact nature of it. And then it's making artifact tokens, so if you're doing stuff that cares about that, get your Urza Saga and make some big constructs.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at how much the artifact thing has ended up mattering on Third Path Iconoclast in my own cube.
Yeah.
I think initially I've said multiple times, I felt like that card was pandering to me. I wasn't that interested in playing with it, but I also felt like it would basically just be almost a carbon copy of Young Pyromancer. I'm like, do I really want cards that are so functionally similar in this spot? And practically it has not been that way at all. Like, people oftentimes will draft a more artifact-focused deck with a Third Path Iconoclast that has a bunch of one-drop artifacts and an Urza Saga package, and then your Iconoclast is making more tokens, which makes your Saga tokens bigger. It has definitely played out more synergistically than I expected, and so maybe that's part of what we're seeing here.
Also notable, it flips off of battles, or it triggers off of battles, and I'm winking or wiggling my eyebrows, but you can't see it over a podcast.
Creepy Uncle Parker.
Okay, well, not in a creepy way. It is the most tested incubate card in our list, and I think, it's a callback to Shark Typhoon. It has double-faced tokens, not double-faced itself, which is fine because we all know that the most commonly used token is just a face-down sideboard card anyways, so what does it matter if it's double-faced? You'll just say, this is no longer an incubator, it is now a Phyrexian.
Wow, when do we get a card that manifests cards from your sideboard?
Hey,
yeah.
Infinity 5 or Mystery Booster Playtest Cards 6 or whatever. We'll get it.
Yeah, I think as far as double-faced technology goes, this one is quite light-fingered in terms of implementing that, and that might make it a little more appealing. But still, 30% for our fourth most tested card isn't saying a lot compared to previous sets. And I think that speaks a lot to the lack of community consensus around this set. Doesn't mean Chromehost Seed Shark is not powerful, it just means people don't agree on what's powerful. As a comparison, Crimson Vow was the least consensus set in recent memory, and its most tested card, Thirst for Discovery, was tested by like 40% of our respondents.
All right, that brings us to our number 3 most popular card from March of the Machine, and that is Deeproot Wayfinder. 1 and a green for a 2/3 creature Merfolk Scout. Whenever Deeproot Wayfinder deals combat damage to a player or battle, surveil 1, and then you may return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is rated 6.3 and tested by, again, around 30% of our respondents, so basically very similarly beloved as Chromehost Seed Shark. I'm among these testers. This is the first card on this list that we have reached that I'm actually testing, and I think this card is potentially appealing. I've become more and more excited about Thalia and the Gitrog monster. Not excited in the sense that I think it's going to stay in my cube for a long time, or I think it's great or whatever, but it feels like in my cube specifically, there's just enough incidental land things that have been going on that a lands matter deck can truly come together. And this, I think, is a cool part of that. Like, you think about combining this with something like Lotus Cobra, right? Where you crack a fetch land, and then your Deeproot Wayfinder, gets it back, and it comes into play, and I guess you get that mana during your combat step. Maybe that's not the most useful example. But this does have synergy with other things that care about lands going to your graveyard or being in your graveyard. And me being on double fetches, I think this card's going to be pretty appealing if it can get in. And I'm still not convinced that 2-mana 2/3 is going to be able to get in all that often, but time will tell, I guess.
There's a little bit of tension in this design because a 2-mana 2/3 is really good at blocking.
Right.
But it's got that Saboteur trigger where it wants to be attacking. And I guess a 2-mana 2/3 is good at surviving attacks. You can, if you're on the play, you can attack into your opponent's Savannah Lions or whatever really easily. So yeah, it's interesting. There's some tension here. It's not like a Swiss Army knife or an all-in-one kind of thing. You have to have some synergy with other cards. The fetch lands have to put themselves in the graveyard, or you have to have self-mill or discard or something.
I mean, it does have the surveil right there, so you can get lucky sometimes.
I think it depends on the power level of your environment. In my power level, you definitely have to be doing other stuff before you're excited about playing this card,
right.
But I could see at lower power levels, just a little card selection and maybe a land is worth it.
Yeah, I mean, even just the surveil is going to be relevant in some contexts, even if you don't end up getting that land back.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of Grimflayer, which is a card I have really enjoyed the play patterns of, power level aside. It's maybe not amazing, but I still enjoy playing it in my cube, and this has pretty similar feel to it.
So that means it's time for our number 2 card from this set. Faerie Mastermind. 1 and a blue for a 2/1 creature fairy rogue. It has flash. It has flying. It has, whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card. And it has an activated ability. 3 and a blue. Each player draws a card. And for those who don't know, this is Yuta Takahashi's World's Champion card that features their likeness. And it's tested by almost a third of our respondents with a rank of 7. So the things I like about this, number 1, I'm kind of a sucker for this like historical lens or quality to it. I think it's really cool. I watched this match where Takahashi became the world champion. So I think that's just really neat. But
I have a soft spot for the invitational cards too, which I guess is now the World Championship cards. But yeah, I think they're really cool.
I like that they've started putting the players' names in the flavor text now as well.
Yeah.
Some of the old ones, Mark Rosewater recently just did a podcast about these, and there's a bunch that I just had no idea were invitational cards.
Yeah, like people don't know Avalanche Riders or whatever is an invitational card.
Or Solemn Simulacrum. So it's really cool, I think. But then this card is also pretty powerful. 2 mana, 2/1 flash flying is like a fine rate by itself. And then we've also got multiple layers of upside. The fact that it has flash means that you're more likely to get that second draw trigger because you can flash it in response to your opponent's thing. They didn't know you had it. And so you can kind of profit almost at whim, I guess. The activated ability can be activated on the opponent's instep to make them draw, and then you draw 2. And then you untap, draw your card for turn, and you're just like massively up. I've done that multiple times in Limited, and
you're up 3 cards. And if they were tapped out on their turn, you also get the first crack at using all 3 of those cards you're up before your opponent gets to use the 1 additional card you gave them.
Yeah, it only takes a couple times of that to really seal the game in your favor. So this card is competitively costed. It'll fit into most Eternal cubes like Andy's or mine, kind of without making any concessions to power level. And then it's also got this cool historical real-world angle.
Do you think it's fun, Parker?
I don't know. I do like
Don't
flyers.
ask the hard questions. I know it's powerful and I can explain why, but don't ask the hard questions like, is it fun?
I think it's fun because, let's compare this to like Leovold that just shuts off your opponent's second draws.
Oh, yeah,
I think this is more fun than Leovold.
Yeah, I think Leovold's maybe among the least fun Magic cards of all time, potentially, a lot of people would say.
Yeah, maybe so. Or maybe Esper Sentinel is another good comparison, where it doesn't prevent your opponent from having fun. It just means you profit a little bit, and it kind of is anti-snowballing in that way. So if your opponent is drawing 1,000,000 cards, Faerie Mastermind will ensure that you're drawing 500,000 cards or whatever.
I wonder if this is going to be relevant as well in multiplayer environments, because this will trigger on each opponent's turn, and people love drawing cards.
It definitely seems to me like it was carefully templated to be very relevant in a format like Commander.
I don't know. I'm really psyched about this card.
I'm excited to get in some reps with it to see how I feel about it, because I'm still like, is it fun? I don't know. I think maybe, but we'll see.
I also like that the stat line easily trades with things, and it doesn't grow itself like Ledger Shredder, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is going to be used proactively. It's going to get into combat, maybe. And I think there will just be a lot more push and pull here than with a card like Ledger Shredder, where sometimes you just use the 2/4 body to stonewall your opponent, and that's the end of the story.
All right, our number 1 card, and this is not really beating everything out by a wide margin. It's just tested by a third of our respondents with a rank of 7.1. So same rating, average rating as Halo Forager. This is Khenra Spellspear. It's 1 and a red for a 2/2 Jackal Warrior. It has Trample, Prowess, and 3 and a Phyrexian blue mana. I'm not really sure why it's blue. Transform it, and it turns into a 3/3 with Trample, Ward 2, Prowess, and Prowess.
Prowess, baby!
Prowess. Almost as fun as Cascade. That one.
Say Cascade 4 times fast. You can't.
I cannot, apparently. It's been demonstrated. Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously just a very powerful card, clearly powerful card. It is an uncommon, which again means it's just available to a lot of people that are playing within rarity restrictions. 2 mana, 2/2 Trample Prowess is going to be difficult to block. It's going to get in for a lot of damage, and then you have this upside of getting to Prowess that is going to lead to some insane games where you just, I don't know, how big is this guy going to get?
I bet it could get pretty big. I suspect there are a lot of peasant cube curators that are excited to be getting maybe more complicated cards like this. Like, this is a lot of text for an uncommon. It does a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And they even found some room for flavor text here. That's I mean, an upside of double face cards.
And that's a reason for you to look at the back, because you don't really care about the mechanics, you just care about that flavor text.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think it's cool peasant designers are getting some more complicated cards, and that's just one step closer to them just putting a couple rares in, which is what I prefer most of them do. So we'll see. But yeah, this card is still not on my testing list. I have not picked it up. I think it would be good in my cube for all the reasons stated, but I feel like I can be picky about my Spells Matter payoffs at the size that I'm at and with how many cards we have access to. And this one is just a little bland for me. Like, it just beats down, and 4 mana at sorcery speed to flip it is not super exciting to me. I'm not excited to get it shocked in response or something. So, yeah, I don't know. It's not there for me quite yet, but I could see myself coming over to this the same way I came over to Third Path Iconoclast.
I think you can be picky about your payoffs at any power level or size, but I get your point. Is this just a little more of a Timmy Tammy Spells Matter payoff? Like, it goes huge. It gets, like, I don't know, facing down a 7/7 Trample Ward 2 is just, like, so discouraging. It happened to me a couple times in Limited.
Yeah, that's just 2 spells. Now it's a 7/7, so...
Yeah, it's so enormous when it flips.
Yeah, I don't know if this is more of a Timmy Tammy card than, like, a Sprite Dragon or something, which I really enjoy the play patterns of a Sprite Dragon compared to this. The haste is so relevant, I think. Like, there's multiple times in my cube where I have... out of nowhere, played a Sprite Dragon and then made it a 3/3 or a 4/4 and attacked immediately. Just been able to trigger it that many times the same turn I cast it. And this doesn't have all that going for it, so we'll see.
2 things I will say about the design of this card. Anthony, expressed some surprise at the Phyrexian blue mana to transform. Dave Humphreys and Mark Rosewater have talked about how they wanted a feeling of transformation, and they wanted the cards to flip into a version that was like slightly color bent for mono red, because technically you could play this in mono red and flip it. And having Ward 2 in red is a little bit of a color pie bent. But they wanted that feeling of like something that is normal, a Jackal Warrior on Amonkhet, has been transformed into something a little transgressive or a little like alien. And so that helps convey that feeling. And, at the point when you're paying 5 total mana for a mono red threat, you've kind of earned yourself a color pie bend. Maybe destroy target permanent is a color pie bend for most colors, but if you pay 7 mana, you get Meteor Golem, and everybody gets the color pie bend. So, it's partly tied into rate.
Sure. I get that sort of flavor angle of it.
And I guess the second thing I'll say is, normally, like with our Innistrad sets, Daybound, Nightbound, very recently, we've seen that double-faced cards get a little bit of a penalty with our cube curators. I think our audience, maybe relative to most Magic players, or maybe not, but they're a little bit hostile to double-faced cards. So I didn't expect to see this one at the top of our list.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, in contrast to though, there's a lot of like big splashy stuff in the set that I'm kind of surprised to see fall so low. Like all the team up cards are pretty low down in terms of the number of people testing them. The actual Phyrexian Praetors, these like huge, splashy, exciting things that are kind of the face of the set in a lot of ways. Where even is the first one in this list? It's really far down.
It's a Command F Praetor.
I could do that. So yeah, I mean, I think that does speak either to the fact that they're just cube designers in general maybe are not as interested in big, huge, splashy mythics, and they're more interested in these more efficient, cheaper cards, or it could speak very much to the bias of our particular audience.
Yeah, and I want to note that like the Spellspear compared to Daybound, Nightbound, it's not going to flip back and forth, right? You flip it once, and then it stays flipped until it goes back to the graveyard or back to your hand or whatever.
Yeah, I still think this is one of the most elegant ways to do double-face cards, which I think is why we see them maybe not being penalized, because, Daybound, Nightbound, the problem there is not so much the double-face cards as it is tracking a game state, regardless of whether a card is in play for the rest of the game. And, the same can be said for some of the really complicated modal double-face cards. Or maybe the problem wasn't strictly double-face cards, but, like, modality, where half of the modes are invisible if the card is in a sleeve until you flip it over. So, this not having any of those problems, right? And it being very clear to both you and your opponent that, yeah, if I pay this mana down here, like, it's going to be really bad for you. And do you have to know exactly how bad for you? You don't have to have that memorized necessarily. You just know that that's a thing you got to be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. So I think some of the transform usage in this set is fairly restrained. Some of the transformation conditions are made with awareness of the weakness of transforming and like some of the logistic hurdles it comes with. And this design and others kind of mitigate that drawback in a really nice way, I've found, in a really refreshing way. It is worth zooming out a little bit and talking about, as Anthony mentioned, the lack of any high consensus, high test rate card in this set. Last set, we had Cankerbloom tested by over half of our respondents. In some sets, like when Consider came out in Midnight Hunt, it was tested by like 70% of our respondents. Khenra Spellspear is only tested by a third of our respondents. Like, barely a third.
I wonder if this is honestly just going to be a trend that we see continuing in all of our responses. Like, right, every new set, you just have more new cards to choose from, right? Like any cube designer, now if they were choosing from 100 cards for a particular slot or role in their cube, they're choosing from 100 plus N cards, and that's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger over time. You know, we've only been doing these surveys now for, what, like 4 years-ish? Mm-hmm. Which...
Only, you say?
Yeah, I mean, 4 years is still a long time, but, you know, not super long in terms of the arc of all of Magic, but, you know, if we keep doing this for 6 more years, are we going to be very clearly see, you know, the 10-year history of cube designers being like, oh, actually, we didn't have as many options at 3 mana in blue for this kind of effect, and now we have so many of them that nothing rates super highly anymore because everybody could just be playing other options that are available to them.
Perhaps. And I'd actually kind of be glad to see that because that means...
Oh, yeah, for sure.
People are being a little less, like, hype train about it, or I don't know.
Parker hates a hype train. Don't you dare get hyped around Parker.
No, I hate capitalism. That's what's going on.
Yes, I really... This is especially a set where I think it's really worth spending some time looking at the long tail, as it were, of all the community survey responses, because, like we've said, there aren't any huge standouts, and so if you want to see what people's opinions are on Sheoldred or the rest of the battles or Urabrask or whatever, I think you're going to have to pick through here and do some of that work yourself. In fact, basically all of our hot takes were about cards that we didn't discuss today, so for now, just enjoy all of our hot takes strung together back to back.
I think Nahiri's Warcrafting is a really powerful card that could potentially see play at higher power levels. The fact that it kills creatures that red normally struggles with dealing with, and also it's just like a 2-for-1, killing a 3/3 or whatever, and drawing a card basically is a lot for 3 mana, and I think the card's really powerful.
Urabrask is a card you'll see in every MTGO Vintage Cube clone on the planet ever.
My hot take is for the card Vengeant Earth. I totally missed this card during preview season, and people might be sleeping on it. I think that the base case of this card, Elemental Uprising, is better than most people give it credit for. If Ambush Viper is the Doomblade of green, then I'd argue that Elemental Uprising is the Grasp of Darkness of green. There aren't a lot of green removal spells that work on an empty board, and the fact that this trades with X4s means that, in a lot of environments, it will remove most of the creatures that matter. Additionally, if you animate the land with Addendum, having a hasty lure creature can really mess up blockers in red-green aggressive lists, especially alongside other red-green aggressive creatures that mess with blocking like Earthshaker Khenra and Radha's Firebrand. But that extra text, creature or land, shouldn't be ignored. This card can also be an uncanny speed in the right contexts. It's a shape change effect that doesn't remove abilities and grants haste. This means it works with powerful attack triggers like Dreadhorde Arcanist and Kari Zev, and could just be a solid combat trick the rest of the time if you don't have an extra untapped land lying around.
So I have to admit, I was pretty skeptical when Mark Rosewater said that the game was going to fundamentally change with the release of Mom. But I think I have to give it to him. The fact that you can now summon Pinkerton agents to bust down your opponent's door and humiliate their partner and probably scare the shit out of them is a pretty radical shift to how we play Magic. So my hat's off to Mark and the design team. The rest of the set looks like ass, but Pinkerton agents are a pretty crazy power creep. Okay, bye.
It's also interesting, we didn't even talk about the cards that actually have the highest average ratings. Timberland Ancient is just a 6 mana, 6/5 with Reach and Trample. Its average rating is 7.8. Only 4.5% of the people actually testing it, but some people out there really care about forest cycling. And so, yeah, I think there is going to be a lot of little things in the set for different people. I mean, we also talked about this on the previous episode, how even though a lot of the themes and mechanics aren't really appealing to me, there are just a lot of individual cards that I think really make sense in some of my cubes.
Yeah, so I think one thing here is that a lot of the rate of the set is tied up in battles, number one, which we've already discussed are like unknown and weird and new and new. I can say that twice, maybe.
The new.
Yeah, so people are maybe a little cautious on them. And then a lot of the set's other most powerful cards are really heavy multicolor cards like Thalia and the Get Rock Monster. And I love that card, and I'm really excited to play it. But maybe some respondents are like, I already have an Abzan card that I love, Siege Rhino or whatever, and I'm not looking for another one. Or maybe their mana's not good enough to cast Thalia consistently.
It is not surprising to see a 3-color card not that high, right? I'd be very surprised if we ever saw a 3-color card breaking like the 15% testing rate.
Oh yeah,
that would be shocking to me. So yeah, I'm not surprised to see that down there. I just think it's a good shout
that
out.
That goes for Baral and Kari Zev. It goes for Kagla and Yadaro. Like, there's so many powerful team up legends in this set, but they all are multicolored. And then there are some other powerful cards, but they're double faced, or they transform, or so there's just like a lot of power tied up in effects that we typically don't see making big splashes in our prospective surveys.
I'm not going to let the two of you out of here until you let me talk about Death Creator's Champion a little bit. We
absolutely should.
The most popular card from the March of the Machine Commander survey, which did get about half as many responses as the main survey, so take all these percentages in that context. I think a lot of these people filled out this survey so they could tell us they were testing Death Greeter's Champion, which is being tested by 60% of the respondents to this survey with a rank of 7. The rules text on this card, again, is 2 in a red for a 2/1 creature-human warrior. It's got dash for 3 in a red, and it's got backup 1 and double strike. And we talked about the various potential ways this card could play out in part 1 of our set review, because it's a card I'm really excited about. And I got to say, over time, just over the past week and a half, 2 weeks since we recorded that episode for our personal cube inclusions, I've only gotten more and more excited about this card. I think it is just so cool. It's powerful, but powerful in a way that asks you to synergize with it in some way, to do something interesting with that +1/+1 counter and that temporary double strike, or, save up some mana and repeatedly dash it in, or whatever. It's just a great fit, I think. People are going to be so shocked. I've cut Lelia from my cube for this, just for a while, just to test it out, because I know what Lelia does. Lelia is very standalone. It doesn't really synergize with much of anything, aside from, I guess, like the gravy of delving some cards away to make it huge.
Galvanic Relay.
But this has just got so many more interesting ways to tie it into other cards and make something novel happen. So I'm pumped about this card. I think it's going to be cool.
I also think it's really strong, and I just want to support you for cutting a card you know about, even though it's powerful, to try a card that's new.
Yeah, I do that a lot, and people will sometimes leave comments in my Cube Cobra and be like, gasp, why are you doing this? And I'm like, because I can always put it back in. Whatever, dude. It's fine. It's just cards. I do want to real quickly highlight that the other card that we talked about in our set review that is on the March of the Machine Commander survey here is Wildfire Awakener. Comes in at number 3, just under Guardian Scale Lord, and being tested by 23% of our respondents with a rating of 5. This is that 3/2 Convoke guy that is in red-white and makes other tokens. Compared to Death Greeter's Champion, I've only gotten lower and lower on this in my head as time has gone on. So those cards, I think, were kind of even for me when we recorded that first episode. They were both like, I don't know, 6s or 6.5s for me, where it was like, these cards are potentially promising, but I'm not like sold on them. And I've gotten more excited about Death Greeter's Champion and more skeptical of the Awakener, but play must be had with both of them.
I feel baited because I plan on playing this tonight, if you're listening to this episode the day it comes out on stream.
I mean, I am really interested to see you play it, and I think you should. I still think it's good, right? The question of whether you should play it in your deck is very different from whether I should include it in my cube.
True. I just want to put all those tokens in the chopper.
Get into chopper.
Death Greeter's Champion, with that 60% test rate of 110 people, that would rank about, number 4 or number 5 most popular card on the main set. So
really saying something.
This is big game. Yeah.
And I'm sure there are people that are also going to be testing it that didn't bother to fill out the Commander survey because they never filled out the Commander survey. So we don't often see a card like this be this popular from the Commander set, because there are so many people that just straight up ignore it. They're like, I don't play Commander cards because either they don't come in foil, or I know players are going to be less familiar with them, or I don't like the Commander set symbols, right? There's a million reasons why people don't play with Commander cards.
There's so many cards, and you got to pick what you're focusing on somehow.
You got to cut down somehow. So even with all of that, it's still being tested by a lot of people. So I think high praise on the survey for Death Greeter's Champion.
And that actually makes the backup mechanic really well represented among our respondents. Like, in the main set, the highest tested backup card is Boonbringer Valkyrie with only like 10% testing. So that kind of undersells how popular backup was among our respondents. And I guess one last like honorable mention sneaking in at the last minute. We did not talk about a single common from this set. So for our Pauper listeners, Seed of Hope is the most tested card with like 10% of our respondents. It's a green mana for an instant, mill 2 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand, and then you gain 2 life. So it's like, it can be sleight of hand if you build your deck around it, or like are heavily creature and battle focused or whatever.
Sleight of hand, but binning the card instead of putting it on bottom is very relevant.
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's pretty powerful, but I also think this low test rate speaks a little bit to the fact that the rares were relatively juiced in this set relative to the commons, maybe.
I'm going to do a thing I almost never do and also don't like when other people do, and just say that I wish so bad this card said, if you don't, draw a card on it, and also get rid of the life gain. Like, I mean, if it was just, look at the top 2, or mill the top 2, put a permanent from your hand into play, or if you don't or can't, just draw a card. I know it would be way better. It would kind of be like the green preordain at that point. But would it be better than Abundant Harvest? I don't think it'd be like right up there with Abundant Harvest, and I'd be much more excited about it.
I think it'd be better than Thought Scour, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because it's just Thought Scour with upside.
Okay. So you're one of those people asking why can't green get more harmonized in Commander?
Wow.
Do people ask that in Commander?
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe not so much anymore. But...
They want green to have harmonize? Haven't they seen all the other sources of card advantage green has?
Well, they don't get card advantage on 1 mana instance.
Anyway, I promise never to do that very much, but I read this card, and we've gotten
never to do it very much.
I promise I won't do that much anymore. Look,
everybody gets
maybe
one.
Morning podcasts are not the thing we should be doing. I don't know. But they've given us so many cards with that rider before. In the past couple years, I've even said on the show, like, I hope we get more cards with this. If you fail to do the thing that we're saying you can do, just draw a card, rider on them. And this was a perfect opportunity to do that and make a really juiced blue preordain, which would have been cool.
A blue preordain?
Green. Damn it. All right, we're done here. This is it. Does anyone have anything else to say before I shut this podcast off and we can all stop speaking for the next couple hours?
I don't think there's much to say except that this is the longest tail cube perspective that we've ever done. So there's no excuse not to go check out the article, check out the awesome graphs that Anthony has built, and look at the data for yourself.
Great.
We did it.
I'm going to take one more moment here to plug the YouTube channel, which I still get people that say, I didn't know you had a YouTube channel. So we've been posting gameplay videos of Paper Cube on YouTube a lot for the past 3 months, 4 months, and I'm hoping to do it more. We're like a couple hundred people short of the monetization threshold on YouTube, and I'm not even sure we're going to do that yet, but I think it's just a switch you flip, and I'm pretty sure YouTube shows ads to people regardless of whether you actually individually monetize your video or not, because they need to pay their server hosting bills. So if we get to that point, I would love to like maybe try and hire a video editor with some of the YouTube monetization money. So I have some plans there, but we need a couple more subscribers. So even if you don't watch YouTube, just go hit the subscribe button. I don't care. YouTube doesn't care that you don't watch videos. They just want to see that number go up so they can give us the monetization power. Anyway, check out the YouTube. We've been doing good stuff over there. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony Parker and I getting up on a Saturday morning and thinking really hard about Magic cards and kind of speaking into microphones about it. We messed up a lot.
We did.
Thank goodness for the magic of editing.
Did everyone have their coffee today?
I did, and I'm jittery. Maybe that explains it.
You won't like me until I've had my... Don't try and make me make a podcast before I've had my coffee. All right, that's it. We're done here.
Okay. But watching your coaching I can't talk. Why did we do a morning podcast?
Because you guys said it would be great.
Oh boy. So, we're not talking about I I don't know what I'm saying. It's fine. I got lost.
It's fine. We have the magic of editing.